My name is Charlie Michael, and I'm the Education Outreach Coordinator at National Farmers Union. Our project, the Local Food Safety Collaborative, is an FDA-funded initiative to provide training, education, and assistance to farmers serving local markets. We're a nationwide network of more than a dozen food and agriculture organizations who really believe that good food safety management is good farm management. Our top priority is connecting underserved populations of all types with assistance and resources that are appropriate to their operation type, scale, and cultural context. We really want to get everyone talking to each other, produce safety educators, regulators, and farmers, to demystify food safety, speak in a common language, improve market access, and improve livelihoods ultimately.
I'm Kim Carlin, the Produce Safety Program Specialist here in Pennsylvania with the Department of Agriculture. As part of the implementation of the Produce Safety Rule, which is a regulation under the Food Safety Modernization Act, we are offering on-farm readiness reviews. Now, these on-farm readiness reviews are free, non-regulatory assessment of your farming operation. This tool was developed to provide guidance and support to the farmer, as well as familiarize them with the Produce Safety Rule. This regulation is new, especially for farmers who have not typically been regulated in the past. We walk around the property and look at the operation, and we have discussions and explain how you fit within the rule and the things you're doing right and the things that you may need a little help with. Go through all of these with the idea that the goal is to prepare the farmer for the inspection. Today we're here at Josie Porter Farm, and we are going to do an OFRR and see how they fit within the regulation and offer them some guidance. Gary and Heidi, thank you for inviting me out here to your farm. Today we're here to do an on-farm readiness review, and as we discussed this is non-regulatory and it is confidential. Any notes that are taken on the farm stay on the farm. We're going to go through a series of questions and just look at your operation and see how you fit within the rule. It's very informal, so if you have questions, please feel free to ask me anything. This is the time when you want to be asking those questions. We're going to get you ready for that inspection so that you fly through that with no problem. So we'll take a walk around the property and look at your setup. We'll look at your restrooms. We'll look at your hand washing areas. We'll take a look at your growing and harvesting practices and procedures. We'll talk about how you're sanitizing, cleaning and sanitizing your equipment. We'll look at storage. We'll look at the chemicals that you're going to be using as we walk around the farm. So let's start off with just your overall food safety policy. What policies do you have in place as far as your employees and visitors?
We have this little volunteer kiosk and employee training area. We use a lot of materials, including the field training kit for fresh produce handlers from Penn State Extension, which is a handy guide for people to flip through and check out. We also have another sign-in sheet if we've missed them. And also we have a training log as well, which also so that we can record that we've done trainings both with our volunteers and with our employees as well. And the other thing that we have here is just a reminder about our visitor health and hygiene policies, a reminder that no pets are allowed in the fields, as well as a medical kit, in case somebody gets hurt out in the field. They can see that it's here, and so they'll be able to have access to it.
Okay, that's a really good idea. This is a really nice area close to the proximity where they're going to be doing these activities.
Hi, I think this is beautiful, your kiosk for training. Do your trainers actually have a log that they sign in on for each different training that they're trained in, or is there one general log for all training?
What I'm doing here on the farm is I use a general log for everybody. I don't have one specific just for employees and one for volunteers. I'm not sure if that's correct or not, but I figure it's more important that we're recording that we're doing them. So I don't know. I mean, we can ask him.
That you want to be training to the task. If you're just doing a general, if everybody does a little bit of everything, you want to be, incorporating that all into your training. So that's fine.
Okay.
to use one training for everyone,
Okay.
if that works.
Also, how would you measure that to see if everyone is still adhering to their training and following the same directions even when they're busy on a hot and heavy day of getting the produce done?
Well, the produce rule says that you have to train annually. And as needed to correct any nonconformities you see. If you see someone doing something wrong, you want to retrain them. You want to train if you hire in the middle of the season. You get somebody who comes on mid-season, you want to do a training with them. But anytime you see some sort of an issue, it's a good idea to retrain. The produce safety rule requires that at least one supervisor or one party from the farm attend a grower training. So it's up to the supervisor to ensure that the staff is following proper procedures.
Do you ever have train the trainer aspects where someone who has already been trained under your management staff then trains your other staff or your trainees, or is that acceptable?
That's acceptable. Anybody who can train, as long as they have a good understanding of the food safety practices of your operation and what it would be required for producing a safe crop. So that was going to be one of my next questions, is how do you train your employees? What do you train them on when you do train your employees? You said you use the flip chart from Penn State. What topics do you cover?
We cover hand washing, we cover
Sickness,
harvesting.
yeah.
You know, one of the things that I actually learned from that was not to put my water bottle in our harvest bins as I'm taking it out to the field.
Sure.
There's always things you can learn from these different hygiene policies. Jewelry, loose jewelry, using a double bin to keep produce off, off the ground.
Sacrificial bins as a harvesting.
Like a blank, yeah.
And
Also
so-
spotting, like if there was poop or something in the field from a deer, or
What not to harvest.
what not to, and to speak to supervisor that you identify something so that it can be quartered off or tagged, an area.
Okay, you're flagging
Safe
those
harvest
areas.
area,
Okay. So how often do you train? You said you do
We
it.
do a major training in the beginning of the season when we bring staff on. And then throughout the year, we'll revisit things as we need to, depending on what kind of issues come up during the season.
kind of corrective training
Yeah.
if there's an issue,
Right.
retraining and that. Okay.
Exactly.
Do all employees receive the same training, or do you have specific training for ones that do specific tasks?
I think the basic is the same for everybody, but when it's, for instance, harvesting, if they're not harvesting and they're just washing or pack washing, you don't really have to talk about harvesting per se.
So everybody kind of gets the same overall
Customized,
training.
but the overall is the same.
And then probably when they're on jobs, when they're doing the job, you kind of reinforce those particular aspects.
Reinforce them or quiz them.
That's always a good one. So do you maintain records of your training?
Yes, we do.
So what exactly are you looking for in a worker trainer log?
So in a working training log, you would want the date of the training. You would want the name of the person doing the training. You would also want to list the topics that you did cover in that training. If you do use, such as the flip chart that they use here, you can simply put you use the flip chart because that does hit on all of that. But if you did harvest training and you trained on, hygiene, you just want to list those topics out. And then of course have everybody write their name and then sign, and then have that signed off by a supervisor or whoever does the training. So as part of your food safety policy, do you have a visitor's log?
Yes, in fact, that's the first thing we do when people come on the farm. And
We ask people to sign in, and on here as well is a list of the things that we want them to,
the actual policy.
the actual policies in place here on the farm. If you're going to be visiting our production area today with us, we'd like you to sign our visitor's log. Thanks, Kim.
We do have a lot of visitors. We have a farm store, and we have activities like, for instance, an open mic night. So this could be tomorrow night. In fact, there may be, close to 150 people here. Do we need to have them all sign a visitor log?
As long as they're not in your harvest or growing areas, you wouldn't need to. But if you were going to take them on a tour there, you would, want to have them sign or at least explain the rules to them prior to entering the field.
Yeah, and we also have a no pet policy for in the
Okay.
field, although we do allow people, leash.
Regulation, in-house.
But we don't want them running in the fields, and our fields are fenced in primarily. So.
Okay, but you'd let them bring them right into the field?
No.
No, so
no.
just around the
Just
perimeter
around
of
the
the field?
perimeters,
Okay,
yes.
that's a good policy. You don't want to be allowing animals in there.
Just to ask a few questions in regards to an urban farm. We have visitors logs as well, but we do a lot of online, so our waivers are actually online for anyone who's coming to volunteer or who's coming for a tour. You'll fill out the waiver, which is our insurance form for anyone who comes onto our farm, because it is a community farm and we are a nonprofit organization. So we have them fill out the waiver online, which gives us a automatic as to their signature and the date that they're coming. But when we have visitors on farm, if you are visiting, say, on a day when we're harvesting, what would you say should be a rule of thumb for visitors on days when they're not trained to do any of those things? What would you say as a rule of thumb? They should not be in the packing area, or should they be allowed to view, or would you have them in a specific area where the visitors would stay when you're in the process of doing your harvesting and packing?
Well, you would want to go over your policies prior to them, or even with signage. If you don't even go over an official policy, like Pick Your Owns do that a lot. They'll just have signs saying wash your hands, don't touch anything, and that. And it would be okay to take them into the areas as long as they understand that they're not going to be touching the product and they're not going to be touching any food contact surfaces, so they can come there to observe, But you do want to do that little bit of training ahead of time so they're not eating and drinking and bringing their animals in and things like that. So one of the most important aspects of food safety is personal health and hygiene. Now, we did talk about health and that a little bit earlier on. As far as hygiene goes, you want to make sure that you are providing your visitors and your employees with a toilet facility and a hand washing facility that is easily accessible to the areas that they are working. So as far as providing restrooms and hand wash facilities for your employees, what do you have here on the farm?
We have 2 porta potties on the farm. We have one here by the field, and then we also have one over by our CSA distribution center and store. We do have a hand wash station in a couple of different places throughout the farm. One over by the porta potty by our CSA distribution. This is our break area. And the porta potty is not far from here. So this is where people would come to wash after using the bathroom.
So they're all easily accessible
fields,
within
yeah.
the
Near the
area where
fields.
you're doing that activity.
And then we have another hand washing station also in our barn, before people are handling food or washing food.
Near the pack house.
So you have multiple, and they're all supplied by the well.
Yes.
So things you want to consider with your hand washing is you want to make sure that you have running water. And you need to have soap and single-use paper towels. Now, I know in this situation it's an outdoor sink, and we have a double sink here, and we had suggested that using one of them as a hand wash because it was located here, and this is fine. You can use one for hand wash, and you can use the other one for produce wash. Just want to be careful not to splash any water or anything over that. As far as stocking it, do you keep a log, or do you regularly check to make sure that it is fully stocked?
Yes, we do have a log, and we do check it frequently to make sure it's stocked.
Yeah.
And then what about your restrooms? Are they serviced? Do you service them, or do you have a company that?
It's a company. Gotta Go Potties is the company we deal with. So they clean them regularly on a Monday.
Do you have any type of a spill response if the porta potties were to tip over or spill?
Good question. We would call them immediately. We have the Gotta Go number, and they do provide service right away.
So I know that they're not located, which is a good thing. They're not located adjacent or near the fields where you would have an issue if it did spill in there. But something you would want to consider is if it did get on the ground, you may want to isolate that area so people are not walking through it. Think about contamination on the feet and walking into your packing or your harvesting areas.
One of the things that I'm wondering about is we have bar soap here. Is that sufficient?
Well, I would not recommend using bar soap just because every time you're handling that, you could become recontaminated. So I would think about putting a dispenser there where you could dispense it.
In response to this sink being used for multi-purpose, If you're washing your hands in one sink and you have produce in the other, is there any type of protection that you need to have so that water doesn't splash? Or in reference to birds and their poop, is there anything that we need to do to protect the sink that has the produce going inside?
Prior to using the sink for produce, you would want to make sure that you're cleaning and sanitizing that. So something you would want to consider, since this is an outdoor sink and there can be potential contamination from birds or other things, is that you want to inspect this sink before you use it. You would want to give it a good cleaning with soap and water and then sanitize it with a food grade sanitizer to ensure that there's no contamination. So Gary and Heidi, a big part of food safety that you want to consider is your water. Is what the Produce Safety Rule calls an agricultural water. That would be any water that comes into contact with the edible part of the crop. And so can you tell me a little bit about your water source and the uses and how you do apply it?
Sure. Yeah, this is our sole source of water. It's a drilled well, approximately 200 feet, 230 feet down, but it supplies all of the water to our pack house and to the fields. We have a pump house here with a 5 horsepower pump with a variable frequency drive that equalizes the pressure for the fields, so we can have more than one field being watered. Yeah. But there's also a backflow preventer, which I know is important for food safety.
Yes.
That's inside the pump house there. Our supply system right now, the water comes in here, goes into the pump house, and then there's a line over there that's a 3-inch PVC that goes down in the ground. We have about 1,000 feet buried underground to deliver it to the fields. But we have 12 risers, with 2-inch risers coming up from the 3-inch main, and they supply each of the fields. So they're positioned strategically throughout to be able to do the drip irrigation to the fields.
Okay, so have you done any water tests on this?
We did. Actually, we did one in May this year, and we did pass, so no E. coli or coliform. So we'll probably do another one in the fall.
So all your water comes from this source. You're irrigating, you're using this for cleaning and sanitizing, and you're using this for hand washing,
We
correct?
are, yeah. So, and I know there are some differences with agricultural water that goes to the field and what you wash with. Is that correct?
It goes back to that agricultural water. Is it coming in contact with that edible part of the crop? So if you're drip irrigating, you really don't have to worry about it. It's not, unless you're growing a root crop like onions, carrots, or radishes, and you're drip irrigating, then that would come in contact. Where you can run into some issues is if you're using surface water like a stream or a pond for irrigation. You want to make sure what the quality of that water is. We use the EPA standard for water quality. So there you want to test that water, and it should be below, if you're going to use it for irrigation, overhead irrigation, 126 E. coli coliforms per 100 milliliters. If you need to use that water source and you can't reach that microbial count, there are ways to get around it. There's an agricultural die-off measurement that can be used. So if you sprayed today and the E. coli was high, tomorrow that number will drop exponentially, exposure to the sun and things like that. So as long as you can document that you have an interval between the time that you irrigated with that water and then you harvested, as long as you have an adequate interval, you can use that water source.
And you mentioned E. coli, but if you just have a coliform issue, you don't want to use it for washing, but that could still be an agricultural.
Well, we are only concerned with E. coli with this regulation. It's not coliform. That's why on your test you want to get something that says zero E. coli. Yes, that's what this rule deals with. So do you do an annual inspection of your water system that is under your control, from the source to the delivery?
Yeah, in the beginning of the season, we usually store the lay flat in the barn over the winter, because we're not irrigating. I've drained the system, before the frost hits. There's two drainage outlets that I just open up the valve and drain the whole system. But we do flush the whole system in the spring. When we turn it back on, we put the lay flat out. Run water through it, open up all of the risers, so that before we attach the lay flat, and then we flush the lay flat before we attach the
Lay flat,
lay
drip
flat
line.
or the drip irrigation
Okay.
to the beds.
Okay. Okay, so just some things you want to consider is, you look around the well here, it is kind of set down here in a little valley, so you want to be concerned about water pooling around that could get down and seep down into the well. You want to make sure you're keeping the weeds down around there, and you just want to make sure and inspect your well cap, your sanitary well cap every year, make sure that it's on there nice and tight and it's not loose. We had talked about that wire or that conduit coming up there. That's something that you'll want to think about sealing up, because that can be a direct line right into your water source and can add some contamination in there. So something you want to consider. And you said that you did have some sort of correction you were going to try to do here?
We bought this corrugated pipe to fit down over there to protect it, to prevent the creepage of the soil coming down on it, which then also grows weeds that are closer to the wellheads.
Good. That's a good plan.
So I'm interested in knowing how you access water, like your water history. What were you guys doing before the well?
When we first came on the farm here, there was no infrastructure whatsoever. We have a creek nearby, so we did have a diaphragm pump that we pumped out of the creek into a water buffalo. We had like a 350-gallon water buffalo. It's still here, haven't used it lately, but we would put that on the back of a pickup truck and then drive it uphill so we had some gravity. It's not something you want to do again once you stop doing that. So, but we did have to work with the conditions we had here, and the stream was nearby, and also used watering cans. So it was a lot of work. So drip irrigation is definitely has made our life easier.
So according to the safety rule as it pertains to urban farm, since we access water from the municipality, we're considered to be exempt. But can we talk about reasons for why we would still want to test the water?
Well, for municipal water, there is no water testing requirement. All you need to do is pull your bill, and usually every year they provide a copy of the water quality. They're doing the actual testing at the municipal authority, so you are not required to do any water testing. Even though you may be an exempt farm, you still want to be following good practices when you're producing food so that you provide a safe food for people.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. One thing I do know is, like, even though the municipality is the one that is actually doing the testing, when it comes to sourcing, like the pipes and different things like that, we want to consider that and test.
You would want to be doing a water system inspection yearly. So I'm not sure how you handle it in the winter, but when you go in there, you want to make sure that whatever's under your control, where that comes into your property, you want to make sure that you have backflow preventers where they're needed. You want to make sure that you're using food grade materials. You don't want to just be using a garden hose. Look into getting a food grade hose. Because there are chemicals, and this rule only deals with potential biological contamination, but you also want to consider chemical contamination, and that can come from hoses and things that are not designed for contact with food.
Right, sitting out in the sun.
Sitting out in the sun, your hose.
Away.
Yep, exactly. Things to
you.
consider. So Heidi, do you wash any of the produce that you harvest from your fields?
We wash most of the produce out of the fields. Some of the products that have a lot of dirt and soil on them still, we'll pre-wash outside, and then we'll bring them in here, and then we'll do a more thorough wash of them.
Okay.
We like to get a lot of the field dirt off before we bring it in, and then we'll fill up all 3 of these sinks, and we'll do a rinse, and then like a final, and then we're packing. So after we wash our greens in the sink, we use a salad spinner to dry our greens, and then we pack them into clean bags before we take them to market and ready for being sold.
So you're doing multiple batches in each one? Okay, well, how often do you change that water out?
When we feel like it's dirty, too dirty, that's when we change it out. We view it like from
You
We visually
inspect
inspect it, and
Turbine.
we know when it's time to change the water.
Change it up. Now, do you use any sanitizer in the water?
We have not been using any sanitizer in the water. We are looking at using Sanidate in the future for our greens.
Okay, so that is something, that is an option if you wanted to use a sanitizer in the water. And the purpose of putting sanitizer in that water is not to sanitize the crop that's going in there. It is in there to keep the water from becoming a source of contamination. You know, one bad apple makes the whole crate bad, so it's the same
Right.
idea here. So it is something that you can use. If that's something you don't have to use it, a lot of places don't use it, some do. If you are going to use it, make sure that you're monitoring those levels, and you want to make sure that you are using it within the recommended concentration and be testing that. And do you have the equipment to test that?
Yes, we do have test strips.
Okay. Another really important part of your food safety is to make sure that you are cleaning and sanitizing all of your equipment. Anything that should, would, or could come in contact with the edible portion of the crop should be cleaned and then sanitized if needed. So you want to walk me through how you do that?
After we've washed our produce, and we have a lot of dirty bins, you know, we stack them outside on our table out there to be washed, so people know that that's, you know, needs to happen and that they're dirty. We also have a table outside that's just for our clean bins as well.
For drying.
For drying in the sun. We use soap, soapy water to wash our bins, and then we will also use a chlorine mixture as well.
Okay.
To sanitize after we've cleaned.
So you're using a scrub brush to kind of get in those nooks and crannies and
Yeah.
where the bacteria and
Yeah,
that
we
could be?
do. We have scrub brushes, and then actually, I don't have it here, but we also use a toothbrush sometimes too.
Okay, to get in the nooks
To
and
get in
crannies.
the real nooks
Okay.
and crannies. Yeah.
So it's really important that you want to be using a soap solution, soap and water to clean. That is the most important step. And you want to be make sure that you're using an approved product, something that is a soap for food contact surfaces, which a dish soap is just fine. That works fine. A lot of people do use that. You just want to be make sure you're rinsing it off. And then as far as sanitizing, you want to be using a food grade sanitizer. So you really want to pay attention to that label that it says on there, good for food contact surfaces. And another thing you want to do is make sure you're using it at the appropriate concentration. You know, you want to have test strips to be able to make sure that you're following the directions, you're having it, using it at the parts per million that they're recommending that you use it. Read the label, label is the law. The thing with chlorine is that it does lose its potency over time as it's exposed to oxygen, so you would want to be regularly monitoring that.
Okay.
The Sanidate is a little bit better for that because it doesn't lose its concentration. That can sit around in a spray bottle for weeks and it still stays at that level.
Okay. Yeah, and we do have a log here as well of you know
Okay.
when we're sanitizing things, and the date, the time, who's doing it, and then like a note section on what was actually sanitized.
Okay, so something we would want to see is that to be very detailed. You know, we did the harvest bins and we did our knives. You want to list every piece of equipment that you have cleaned
Okay.
and sanitized, and then what you did, if you just cleaned it, if you just sanitized it, and then do you have written SOPs on a procedure of how you do it so everybody knows how you're doing it?
Yes, we do.
You do, okay.
Just need to post
We just
them.
need to post them,
You
right?
post them, yeah. Well, that's not really a requirement, but it does help keep everybody on that same page and everybody doing the same things. So,
Yeah, we've struggled with that in the past of like, okay, who's actually washed and sanitized the sinks, and you know, so it's having the log is really helpful for communication with the team.
okay.
So it's been actually a good practice for us to be in.
Okay, good. Yep, you just want to keep those up to date, and then you should review them within a certain amount of time to make sure that everybody's doing it and signing off on it.
Okay, great.
That's an important part of the rule.
Okay.
Okay.
Kim, I have a question. So I know under the food safety law, pretty much a lot of the urban farmers, we are exempt, right? But when it comes to cleaning and sanitizing, a lot of us like to use, you know, products that are culturally relevant for us. So using apple cider vinegar, and vinegar is really important for us as we use for for sanitation. What do you, for sanitizing, I'm sorry. So what do you, like, what is the law concerning the EPA like?
Well, under the regulation, you can only use products for sanitizing that are labeled for such. By the EPA, they regulate that, and it would label it for use as a pesticide. I don't know that apple cider vinegar or any of the vinegars are labeled that way. And that's not because they may not be a good sanitizer, that's just because the vinegar producers, would have to go through a lot of steps and testing with EPA to be able to get that registration number. Since you're exempt from the rule, you still want to be using products that are food safe, but if you're using vinegar, and it works for you, that's fine.
You used a word or a phrase that was very important. You said something about label being law. Can you speak more about that?
Yes, the label, that's our mantra. The label is the law. You need to be using whatever product you're using, a sanitizer, a soap, anything, any kind of pesticide. You want to make sure that you're reading that and that label, following label instructions, because that is the law. They've done all the testing.
So what exactly does the label have to say?
It would say that it can be used on food contact surfaces or used in produce wash water. Okay. So that's what you're looking for. So Heidi and Gary, you do some packing here on the farm as well?
The wash produce gets packed into boxes and then is taken over to the walk-in. But we also do CSA packing as well for our off-farm deliveries of CSA.
And are you packing these in new containers? Are you reusing? Are you using?
For our CSA shares, we do reuse these boxes. They're 25-pound tomato boxes that we use a plastic liner with handles. So when we take it to the site, delivery site, the customer can just pull out the bag. They have handles, and then we take the boxes back.
And these are clean bags, new liners
They're
that you're
new,
putting
they're
in there?
new every time. So
okay. So something you want to think about, I know you're saying you're reusing some of the containers. Something you always want to be aware of is what was in that previously. This rule deals with the covered products are raw agricultural products, so things that you would generally eat raw without cooking. So if you're going to be using this container for a covered crop as opposed to a non-covered crop like a potato or a squash, a winter squash, you wouldn't want to be using that same container for both. One is covered by the rule, one is not covered by the rule.
We visually inspect them to make sure they're not dirty, or if they are, then we won't use it for produce that is covered under the produce safety rules. Maybe we'll pack potatoes in them or whatever then. But generally, if we see that they're dirty, they'll come out of circulation.
Hey Kim, I wanted to talk more about what Heidi was saying concerning how they decide on the farm, right? Some of the boxes are a little roughed up, and she mentioned potatoes, right? Can we talk about how she might have came up with that conclusion for those who may be unclear about those that, produce that's covered and uncovered?
Sure, I can explain that. So under the produce safety rule, we have what are covered crops and non-covered crops. Covered crops are raw agricultural commodities that are generally eaten raw, things that we don't usually cook. There's no kill step. Whereas non-covered crops would be things like potatoes or corn or beets, things that we would cook before we were to eat them normally. So what you want to think about there is you wouldn't want to be reusing a box that you had, say, potatoes in for something like a tomato or a cucumber. But you could use a box that you used for tomatoes and cucumbers for potatoes because they're not covered. So you would be able to use it for that because you wouldn't be so concerned with any kind of contamination that got in that box from the tomatoes because you're going to cook those potatoes.
Yeah. So the idea is that things that are eating raw, right, can serve as more of a contamination, right? Absolutely. Because we're not rinsing them, or there's no kill step where we're cooking them versus something that we're gonna cook.
Yep. And most foodborne illnesses come from, certain crops, there are certain high-risk crops that you have to consider about your leafy greens, tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, cantaloupes.
Things that we're eating raw.
Yeah, things that we're eating raw. You want to be really, aware of where you're storing your packing materials. So where do you keep them stored?
And our boxes are all stored
off
the ground,
up on shelves.
Okay. And you periodically check for pests and any kind of intrusion, birds, things like that?
Yes, we do.
Okay. And that is something you need to be doing inside of an enclosed building. You want to be doing some sort of pest control. No poisons inside, only snap traps or glue traps, things like that.
Yeah, we seem to have more of a problem come fall going into the winter.
And then when you open up in the spring, or when you come back in, do you do a kind of a look around, make sure nobody nested? And
Oh yeah, we do a major clean in the barn in the spring before we get going for the season.
okay. One of the things you always want to consider whenever you're farming is the previous land use. Have a little bit of history, know what happened at your land. Are there any dump sites? Are there any areas that you should be concerned? I mean, we all know where the wet spots are in that, but we also want to think about, what was the previous land use. You also want to look around you at your adjacent land use. Looks like you've got mostly woods and just other farming areas around you. But you would want to be aware of if you had a residence alongside of you, where's their septic in relation to your fields? Could that be a potential contaminant? And so have you done any type of an assessment of previous land use or your
Well, we've
neighbors?
been on farming this for 14 years, going on 15, I believe, and when we took this land over, it was never farmed chemically. It was actually a dairy farm for many years called the Snyder Farm. And then Josephine Porter, our namesake, farmed it biodynamically, portion of it. But when we took it over, it was really starting to grow invasive weeds. So part of the deal with the township was to deal with that issue.
Okay.
And then, but there was no other, hazardous use. The adjacent lands really are part of the original tract. It was a 400-acre tract. We have about 48 acres of that tract. And also there's the Cherry Creek is down here along the wood line.
Okay.
So there is a residence. We know where his well and septic are on this side, the north side, and then there's a residence on that side with fields.
Now when you're talking about the stream, have there been any issues with flooding from that stream?
We've never really had flooding issues except one time the very lower field did get flooded, but that was a rare occasion. Yeah.
Okay.
So the rest of the field's pretty high elevation-wise.
Okay. And I see it's on a slope, which is nice that water would run off of it. And you don't have a septic on site at this point, but that is something you're looking at.
We have a proposed septic. There'll be a unisex bathroom in that building there, which will run along the outside and then over toward the entrance road. It'll parallel the entrance road as a long sand mound system. So.
Okay, so you have a buffer in between.
And there's
where
a
that
forested
is.
buffer in between.
What about animal intrusion? How do you handle that?
Yeah, actually, one of the first things that we did on this farm was put in a 8-foot-high deer excluder fence using cedar posts. Without the deer fence, I think that first year would have been a bust.
A bust, of course. So if perhaps an animal did get in here, some other type of an animal, and you did see some feces or some poop lying in the field, how would you handle that?
Well, first of all, we train our employees to make those calls and let us know that there's an issue. Groundhogs do get under the fence,
Sure.
And we do have rabbits sometimes and turtles. It's
Occasional
interesting.
turtle.
An occasional turtle, yeah. But if we find it, we then make a corridor around the flagging,
isolate the area.
Isolate the area. Or our employees will come to us and say there's an area, or they kind of know how to handle it. But have to make a determination how bad it is and what it's affecting.
Okay.
If it's just a bird, it could be just a small area.
Okay.
Something else.
And we wouldn't harvest that. They know enough
Yeah,
not to
definitely
harvest
not
that.
harvest that area. So.
Okay, well, that's good then. Something that you can always do is bury as well. Something to think about. If you saw an area where there was a lot, you could always use a shovel and bury it. Something you want to though be aware of is where are you storing that shovel, because that's now the pooper scooper. So you want to make sure you're not sticking that where you're putting any of your tools that may come in contact with food contact surfaces. Okay. What kind of soil amendments do you use?
Yes, we do have. We don't have animals on the farm, so but we do have. Cow manure brought in sometimes. We had horse manure at times, but how we handle that is we treat it as raw manure. But we do compost it and have a period interval where we turn it over, add to it, and then use it most likely in the fall.
Okay.
So that it's separated out.
So you have an application interval between the time that you
Yes.
you spread that and the time that you get into the fields. Well, that's good. That's a good plan.
We do some amendments when we need to build the nitrogen. We have It's called Coop Poop. It's a product, but it's Omni certified,
Okay.
and it is going through.
And do you have a letter of guarantee or a certificate?
There's a
from
certificate
it?
that
Okay.
comes with that.
And
yeah.
that is important if you're going to be buying in any type of a compost or a treated type of an amendment. You want to make sure that they're providing some sort of letter that states that they have treated it to reduce the microbes in that. And that's really important. And that is an issue we're having right now because a lot of the suppliers aren't aware of that and they're trying to figure out, what do we need to say in this letter? But if you're going to be buying stuff in, you want to be aware of that.
Yeah.
So today we completed an on-farm readiness review here at the Josie Porter Farm. And for the most part, they're doing a really good job. We saw a lot of really good practices and procedures in place. And they seem like they would be pretty ready for an inspection, which would be the next step. And that is the whole goal of the on-farm readiness review, is to prepare them for the inspection. Some things we didn't get into, and we would look a little bit more detailed during an inspection. We would look a little bit more at your water test results and your logs that you're keeping, and make sure that you're keeping the appropriate logs. So moving on to inspection, they should be pretty good, and they're doing a lot of what are required under the Produce Safety Rule.
Charlie, what did you learn today at the on-farm readiness review?
Well, I learned a lot, certainly from Kim, but also from Heidi and Gary about what works best in terms of food safety management in their particular farming context. I was really struck by how collaborative and constructive the whole conversation was throughout the day, with both Kim putting questions to them as well as explaining things as we went through. Now, something else, though, that I think really stood out to me was how many of these principles and practices really transcend farming context. I think we saw at the water pump, when we were talking about visitor and volunteer training, that many of the very same things that are relevant to a rural producer also apply in the urban context.
Yep.
And many of those very practical tools and approaches to things like testing your sanitizer solution are practices that I think there is a lot of room for shared conversation and dialogue in a diverse audience of producers in a food safety education setting. So, and with that, as an educator, I'm curious what some of your impressions were.
Well, this was such a valuable opportunity for me to hear and understand what an on-farm readiness review is like, because I teach the Produce Safety Rule, I teach the PSA grower training, and so to hear from the inspector, from the regulator point of view, what they're looking for on the farm was really valuable. So for Kimberly and Nikesha and I as educators to be here today was really educational. And to be able to ask Kim questions about what she's looking for, what inspectors are looking for in the way of record keeping, or digging into the details of the Produce Safety Rule was really valuable.
Yeah, it was really great having you guys here, because I think you brought a different type of perspective coming from your own operations, your own perspective as an educator. It really drew out a lot of really interesting conversation, and I just appreciated how much Kim was willing to engage in a lot of this dialogue around things that might have historically been sort of out of the immediate purview or sort of common ground that a lot of produce safety educators cover. So it was a really great conversation, and it was great to bring the urban, educator, and rural perspectives together on the farm today.
And this is a really well-organized farm.
Yeah.
Heidi and Gary do an amazing job. So it was great to see a lot of the tips and tricks, the farm hacks, as we like to call them, and be able to show that to a broad audience as well. Yeah, this is a great farm.
I think to hear how they came to this, certainly there's some lessons learned along the way as they develop their operation, and it's really great to come to a farm like this where they didn't just show up here on day one and have everything in place. They really had to go through the steps, see the costs, benefits, the trade-offs, and I think ultimately they're seeing a lot of opportunity associated with this in terms of market access and a much higher ceiling for growth, because they've made the investments they needed to up front to get those food safety practices in place now.
That and being more organized makes you more efficient, so you get a better return on investment when you're more efficient. Yeah, so it's a win-win situation.
As we like to say, good food safety management is good farm management.
Yes.